monsters, spells, traps. Long ago, my grandfather used to tell me stories about times of peace, where Summon Skull Beatdown kept balance between the three card types. But everything changed when the Metal Raiders and their leader, the Magic Ruler, attacked. Welcome to the History of Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Fox here, and today we will be talking about the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Extending from June to September 2002. All of you may complain with the release of some cards nowadays that may be overpowered or broken, whatever you guys may call them. But Metal Raiders really changed the game drastically. Maybe not right away, but the impact of Metal Raiders was great, both short term and especially in the long term. Think of a recent format defining set, something like Duelist Alliance for example. This was Metal Raiders back in the day. Actually, this could be said about nearly every set that came out between 2002 and 2004. Each set drastically warped the meta on the level that Duelist Alliance did, if not even more so. Magic Ruler would have just as significant an impact on the July 2002 format as Metal Raiders did. And yes, it's Magic Ruler, not the Spell Ruler crap that Wizards of the Coast pushed onto us. Anyways, Magic Ruler introduced the most powerful spells ever seen in the entire game up until this day, in fact. I think most of the spell cards on the ban list actually come directly from Magic Ruler. So let's take a look at the sets released in this time period in a little bit more detail. On June 26, 2002, Metal Raiders was released. Metal Raiders was a major influence over the July 2002 format, as it was released as the May 2002 format was ending. Despite this late appearance in the May 2002 format though, the cards found in Metal Raiders were influential enough to see hits on the July 1st ban list, just 5 days after their release. Keep in mind at this time though, the OCG and TCG were separate, with separate ban lists as the OCG was run by Konami at the time, and the TCG was run by Upper Deck Entertainment. Even with separate ban lists though, the overall ban lists were very similar. It was mostly them occurring at different times rather than having different contents essentially. The majority of the format though was directed by the powerhouses from the previous format, only now they are coupled with the big power cards coming out of Metal Raiders. It was not until the eve of the July 2002 format that there were new releases that actually changed the format more drastically. On September 1st, 2002, Tournament Pack First Season was released. Tournament Pack First Season was essentially a bridging set that brought over some of the OCG cards that had not yet been released in the TCG. Honestly, there weren't too many notable cards in here except for Mechanical Chaser. Mechanical Chaser was basically the only card of this set that was worthwhile. And maybe White Hole. Just kidding. It was only Mechanical Chaser. Then on September 16th, 2002, Magic Ruler was released. As I mentioned before, Magic Ruler had a profound impact on the game. One could argue that that impact continues to be felt today, as evidenced by our current ban list. If you thought that the Power 5 spells I mentioned before in the May 2002 format were broken, then you have seen nothing at all. Before we go into specifics though, I want to go over the July 2002 ban list. I'm only going to be going over the changes with each list rather than the entire list, just for brevity's sake. What's interesting about the ban list in this era, in 2002, is that the ban list was made in 4 installments, just kind of like how we have now, rather than the biannual installments that we had for over a decade. And in this time, Konami of the OCG made the ban list for both games, rather than having the OCG and TCG decide their ban list separately. So first, let's take a look at the forbidden cards. On the forbidden list is still nothing. At that, let's move on to the limited list. There's only one card on the limited list for July 2002, and that's Mirror Force coming from Metal Raiders. Mirror Force's power in acting like a reactive Raigeki earned its spot here on the limited list. At that, we can take a look at the semi-limited cards. So there's 3 new cards, all of them come from Metal Raiders, and there's 2 monsters, Sangan and Wish of the Black Forest, which were both hit for their floating potential. And then we see Heavy Storm, which is hit for being an essentially free back row clearing card. And it's kind of ridiculous to see this card being semi-limited, especially in our format where Heavy Storm is completely banned. The Heavy Storm debate is one of the most divisive things I've ever seen in Yu-Gi-Oh!, with players arguing fervently for the pro and anti sides to no end. But in this format, Heavy Storm is not only legal, but it's legal at 2. That concludes our discussion of the July 2002 ban list. Now let's move on to the staple cards of this format. During this period of time, The card pool was rapidly growing, and I would estimate that there was a pool of around maybe 80 or so viable cards that could be swapped back and forth in between decks, making for a variety of similarly themed decks, all supporting different techs. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to go into detail on all of them, but I should be able to cover most of the important cards. This was a different time from what you and I know today, and it was a time where archetypes did not exist yet at all, so every card that was released was essentially open for use in anyone's deck. First, let's start with the staple cards that came out of Metal Raiders. First up, we have 7 Colored Fish. With another challenger to meet Lajin, Neo and Battle Ox's graves were finally dug for them, as their 1700 attack power no longer cut it. Then we have Dark Elf. She was the first 2000 attack monster that was readily accessible. The cost was rather high for her attack, but it let you run over Lajin and anything essentially below him. Even Mechanical Chaser and Gemini Elf, which came much later, would not be able to beat her. Witch of the Black Forest was one of the first floaters this game had ever seen. It had a massive number of search targets, with the most notable ones being Summon Skull, Man-Eater Bug, and Magician of Faith. With such a useful search pool, it was run at max number in almost every deck that could run it. Then we have the flip side of Witch of the Black Forest, Sangan. He was not as important as Witch yet, and he was objectively worse than Witch because she could search essentially all the cards that Sangan could, and more. Despite that though, Sangan offered similar advantages to Witch, allowing floating potential and allowing you to search and thin your deck in an era where there were few other methods to do so. Magician of Faith. Given the abundance of power spells in the game, Magician of Faith was a no-brainer. Her ability to recover one of your power spells could end the game then and there if she nabbed you something like a Change of Heart at the right time. Following the Witch Sangan Yin Yang combo, we have Mask of Darkness as the twin to Magician of Faith. Like Magician of Faith, Mask of Darkness had a flip effect, and it was an interesting card that was not as widely used as Magician of Faith because he added traps instead of spells, which at this time were less powerful than the spells. Rounding out the important monsters for Metal Raiders, we have White Magical Hat. Metal Raiders brought forth the first hand control cards, and White Magical Hat was kind of the precursor to Danzalu. He may have had rather pitiful attack, but combined with the equipped spells released in Metal Raiders, and later from Magic Ruler, he could become a significant threat if not dealt with. And there were a lot of people building hand control decks centered around him too. Now we move on to talk about the Metal Raiders spell cards. And first up, we have Heavy Storm. It seems like times never change, do they? Heavy Storm was everything that you would expect, serving as the mass back row clear that you know and love. Remember, it was at 2 at this point in time though. I don't have much else to say about this card. It was just a back row clear and you ran it at 2. Next up, we have Tribute to the Doomed. This card may seem strange with Fisher floating around as free monster removal, but Tribute to the Doomed offered utility that Fisher could not provide. Whether the opponent's monster was face up or face down, you could not escape this spell. This allowed you to avoid annoying flip effects like Magician of Faith. The cost of discarding a card from your hand was minimal versus the detriment of allowing your opponent to plus a card off of Magician of Faith, especially if that card was a very powerful spell like Raigeki or Change of Heart or anything like that. Then we have Tremendous Fire. This card is notable as one of the few burn cards to come from Metal Raiders, and it was the best burn card in the entire game at that point in time, outclassing Ukazi. Its existence made stall burn semi-viable, and some people did actually main deck 1 or 2 in aggressive decks. Now moving on to equipped spells, we have Sword of Deep Seated. This card was the quintessential equipped spell. It offered a modest boost with recurrence that was important for equipped spells. Sometimes the recurrence effect could get in your way, but in the Metal Raiders era, this was essentially the best equipped spell. I remember times of equipping this to random monsters and just beating it up. Following Sword of Deep Seated, we have Stimpak. This card offered the largest boost of any equipped spell to date at 700 attack, and it was used in decks that needed a quick power-up, possibly for cards like White Magical Hat. It had a minor drawback though that quickly made it obsolete. Lastly, we move on to the traps from Metal Raiders. First up is Mirror Force. This card was limited to 1 for a good reason. It worked as a reactionary Raigeki as I mentioned before, but this was in a time where the game was very, very slow, which meant that a well-timed Mirror Force would end games right then and there. Then we have 7 Tools of the Bandit. This was a generic counter trap that stopped all other trap cards. The card was very good, but it was not widely used due to there being few other traps worth stopping. The most notable was Mirror Force, but obviously it's not worth running this card just to stop a single card in your opponent's deck. And for the last of the key trap cards for Metal Raiders, we have Magic Jammer. The brother to 7 Tools, this card was ironically much more heavily used. Today we may look at this in 7 Tools and easily conclude 7 Tools is the far superior card, but at this time, Magic Jammer was the only way to stop spell cards, which were undeniably still the most powerful cards. Stopping anything like Change of Heart, Monster Reborn, Raigeki, etc. could halt your opponent's momentum and turn the tides of the game. Therefore, most people actually ran 2 to 3 of this card in their decks. Now I'll move on to Tournament Pack First Season. As I mentioned before, this was a lackluster set, and as a result there was only one notable card to look at. Mechanical Chaser. At 1850 attack, he became the most powerful monster in the TCG, and he served his role as a beat stick. At least in the TCG, he had some time to shine on his own before Gemini Alpha arrived at our shores. Now we move on to the final and likely the most influential of the 3 sets during this era, Magic Ruler. So the first monster that we're going to look at is Mystic Tomato. This card was the first of the battle recruiters, and as it recruited dark monsters, it was able to recruit cards like Witch of the Black Forest and Sangan, which offered you a kind of floating network, if you will. The rest of the battle recruiters also came out in Magic Ruler as well. Cards like Giant Rat, UFO Turtle, Mother Grizzly, Flying Kamakiri No. 1, and Shining Angel. However, these cards were not as relevant as Mystic Tomato because Dark type still dominated the early game. The one that was more important than the rest was Giant Rat. It would be later used in decks like Warrior Toolbox, Rat Box, and Earth Toolbox. Then we have Cyberjar. Cyberjar. This card does so many things, and in a slow format like it was during that era, it offered you so much potential in a single card. First off, it gave you a dark hole by destroying all monsters on the field, which meant that it could level advantage if you were down. You could just set your Cyberjar, and then if it got flipped, you could turn the game around from there. Number 2, it let you special summon a bunch of monsters after drawing 5 cards, so you could turn the tides against your opponent if you drew more monsters than them. And thirdly, if you did not draw your monsters, you could still keep the cards that you drew, meaning that this card was a Dark Hole, a Mass Monster Reborn, and a Pot of Greed all in one. That essentially covers all of the relevant monsters for this set. The set's name is Magic Ruler, so obviously we would expect the magic cards to be the emphasis of the set. And that is definitely true. The first magic / spell card, as they are now called, is Painful Choice. And Painful Choice at this time, even without the graveyard shenanigans that we see today, was still an incredibly powerful card, as it allowed you to search for essentially one of the 5 cards that you wanted. And no matter what, you would get one of the 5. So Painful Choice was able to offer you a tremendous advantage in not only obtaining one of the 5 cards that you possibly needed, but also in thinning your deck out. As a result, Painful Choice was still an incredibly powerful card at this time. Now I'm going to do 3 cards at once because they all essentially do very similar things. These cards are the Forceful Sentry, Confiscation, and Delinquent Duo. Out of these 3, Delinquent Duo offers you the most in terms of card advantage because it allows you to take 2 cards for the price of 1. However, at this time it was evaluated that the Forceful Sentry was the best of the 3 because it was the only one that was costless and it allowed you to look at your opponent's hand as well, which Delinquent Duo did not offer. Confiscation was a close second, but it had a cost of 1,000 life points. Then we have Mystical Space Typhoon. Finally, a good replacement for the card D-Spell had arrived. Even to this day, Mystical Space Typhoon functions as the most versatile and powerful single spell trap card removal that there is in the entire game. Of course, at this time, it was also the best single spell or trap removal in the entire game. Then we have Snatch Steal. This card was essentially more free monster stealing on the level of Change of Heart. There's not really much else I need to say about this card. Acts of Despair's release essentially made every other equipped spell released up to this point obsolete. Cards like Sword of Deep-Seated and Stimpack were essentially power creeped in a single instant with the release of Acts of Despair. Its 1,000 attack boost was the most that we would see for a very long time. And then the last spell card that I want to talk about is Rush Recklessly. This card offered a 700 attack boost, which is not as much as Acts of Despair, but its ability to be used as a trap card essentially due to its quick play nature offered it more versatility than Acts of Despair did. Magic Ruler also gave us some ritual monsters as well, but none of them were really that notable, except for Relinquish. Oh, and of course I can't forget Hungry Burger. This set also only had 4 trap cards, but trust me, all of them were really bad. Konami sure took this magic ruler idea seriously, focusing solely on the spell cards and completely ignoring the trap cards. Lastly, before I move on to the meta decks of this format, I want to just kind of list off the notable cards that were released, but not really used at this point in time, but they would become important later. Here we go. Senju of the Thousand Hands, Nimble Momonga, Megamorph, Upstart Goblin, Giant Trunade, and Solemn Judgment. That concludes the staples of this era. Now it's time to move on to the last segment of this episode, and probably the one that has been most anticipated, the meta decks. To be honest, the core of most of the meta decks during this time did not change too drastically from the May 2002 format. The beatdown strategy was still the go-to strategy, only with a much larger card pool available now. There is around 80 or so viable cards that were used in competitive play, and players would just kind of mix and match these cards to make their respective decks. You guys have to realize that at this time the game was still taking form, and no one was running the most optimal builds at all. So when you look at the past tournament results and you look at these old deck profiles, if you can even find them, you see these kind of crazy builds that essentially just look like starter deck Kaiba with maybe 3 Acts of Despairs thrown in, or random things like that. Part of that made this era really charming to play in because no one knew what was the best strategy and how to approach the game. So everyone kind of at least had their own flair and style in their decks, rather than these kind of pre-built decks in the archetypes that we see today. And it was for that this period was kind of a Cambrian explosion of decks. Please excuse that evolution joke. As I looked through the old deck lists from this era, there were very few decks that actually ran things like 3 Mechanical Chaser, 3 Delinquent Duo, 3 Confiscation, or anything like that. The game was still young and it wasn't as competitive, so players didn't really focus on making their decks essentially as competitive as possible. Rather, it was just more of using cards that were familiar to you and that you saw in the show, and it was just more excitement behind the game rather than the competitive edge that we see today. As a result, the decks I think that I'll show you are more of maximum potential decks, made with the power of hindsight, rather than what I actually found in the archives of websites like Pojo and Metagame. Since, as I mentioned before, 99% of the decks that were on there were essentially starter decks with random text. With the power of hindsight, I reconstructed the most optimal versions of just several of the deck types that you would see. The variety in the decks possible, though, was rather astounding. You could see decks based around anything from White Magical Hat, equipping him with Acts of Despair, to pure beatdown with Mechanical Chaser and Dark Elf, and Barrel Dragon, strangely enough, was used heavily at the casual level. I saw Barrel Dragon in many decks. Heck, I remember using Barrel Dragon a whole lot myself, probably because I saw Bandit Keith use the card on the show. Without further delay, let's take a look at a July 2002 beatdown deck. When you take a look at this deck, it looks very similar to the May 2002 beatdown decks. Essentially, the major changes are cards like Witch of the Black Forest and Sangan, as well as a teched Mask of Darkness and Magician of Faith, just to recover some of your power spells and power traps like Mirror Force. This deck is also running Magic Jammer, because Magic Jammer was actually highly run at that time, just to counter the power spells as I mentioned before. This deck is very standard, just using high power monsters just to try to push in as much damage as possible. Now we take a look at July 2002 Stall Exodia. This deck wasn't very viable in May 2002, but now with some extra cards it has become actually fairly viable. First off is the search screen cards like Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest, which allow you to essentially search for any piece of Exodia that you need. And then in addition to that, you have cards like Mask of Darkness and Magician of Faith, which can recycle your spells and traps that you need. Mask of Darkness can recycle your stalling cards like Wabaku, as well as Mirror Force and Trapdoor. Magician of Faith can recycle cards to stall or to advance your game, like Swords of Revealing Light or Pot of Greed. So with these extra techs, Exodia Stall finally became semi-viable in competitive play. Lastly, for the July era decks, we have Stallburn. Stallburn still wasn't extremely viable, but it was much more viable compared to how you would build the deck in the May 2002 version. So now that we have a couple more cards, it's essentially the Exodia Stall, but with burn cards instead of using Exodia. So now you have Tremendous Fire and Ukazi to inflict burn damage, as well as Magician of Faith to recycle them back. Using these cards in conjunction allows you to stall the game state and burn your opponent for the win. Now we move on to the September 2002 era decks. There are many possibilities, but I capped it off at 3 just for time constraints. So the first deck that we're going to look at is White Magical Hand Control, and this is exactly as it sounds. You're using White Magical Hat combined with equipped spells like Axe of Despair to control your opponent's hand, and you're also using cards like Forceful Sentry as well. Then we take a look at September 2002 Snatch Beatdown. This is a little bit more elaborate than the beatdown strategy we see before. This essentially makes use of Soul Exchange and Snatch Steal to beat down on your opponent using either their own monsters, or you take their own monsters to tribute for your own summoned skull to further beat them down. And of course you use the all-powerful Forceful Sentry in this deck as well. And lastly, we have my favorite of the bunch, September 2002 Handlock. This deck looks absolutely brutal, and I've never seen a deck list like this from this era, but this was technically possible. You could run 3 Forceful Sentry, 3 Confiscation, and even 3 Delinquent Duo if you desire, but I feel that with that many hand control cards, you're not going to have anything to kill your opponent with after you get rid of their hand. So I kept it at 6 here, but you can go crazy with it if you want. This deck just looks brutal though because of the amount of hand control that it offers. You can essentially leave your opponent with nothing very early on, and you force your opponent to waste resources. That concludes my discussion of the meta decks of this era. There are many other possibilities, but I chose to just look at a couple of different strategies because most of the decks of this era would have fallen under one of these different categories, whether it be some sort of hand control, alternate win condition, or just straight up beatdown. I feel that I was able to give you a snapshot of the meta game at that time just through these several decks that I showed you. If you guys made it all the way here to the end, I assume you enjoyed the video. If that's the case, please leave a comment below and give this video a thumbs up so that I know to make more. Next time on the history of Yu-Gi-Oh!
Fake cards are finally made illegal for play.
What? You mean they weren't illegal before? What was I doing with them?